August 26, 1346. In a muddy field near Crecy, France, 9,000 exhausted Englishmen are about to face 30,000 of Europe's finest knights. The French have every advantage: superior numbers, heavy cavalry, the flower of European nobility in their ranks. They're so confident that French nobles are literally arguing over who gets the honor of killing the English king. For hours later, 1,500 French nobles are dead, including princes, dukes, and even kings. The English? They lost 40 men. Not 400. 40. The age of the armored knight, 500 years of military dominance, ended in a single afternoon, killed by peasants with sticks and strings. This is the story of how a blind king charged directly into death because he refused to miss the slaughter. How French knights trampled their own mercenaries to death in their rush to die gloriously. How Genoese crossbowmen were massacred by the very French nobles who hired them. And how, for weeks afterward, crows grew so fat on noble flesh that they couldn't fly. This is the Battle of Crécy, where medieval warfare died in the mud, where the entire concept of nobility through combat was destroyed by common-born archers, and where the 100 Years' War truly began with France's most humiliating defeat. Let me set the stage for this massacre. Edward III of England had just landed in Normandy with about 15,000 men, claiming the French throne through his mother. His claim was legally questionable but backed by a very real army. For weeks, Edward had been conducting what the French called a chevauchée, basically licensed vandalism designed to prove the French king couldn't protect his people. The English burned farms, looted towns, and destroyed everything in their path. They'd just finished sacking Caen and were trying to escape north to the English-held port of Calais when the French army finally caught them. Philip VI of France had assembled the largest army in Christendom. We're talking 30,000 to 35,000 men, including 12,000 heavy cavalry. Knights in full-plate armor mounted on armored horses. These weren't just soldiers. This was every important noble in France, plus allied kings and princes from across Europe. The Holy Roman Empire sent troops. The King of Bohemia came with his entire court. Majorca sent knights. It was like a medieval Avengers assembly, and they all wanted English blood. The French knights were the tanks of medieval warfare. A fully armored knight on an armored horse weighed about a ton combined. These men had been bred for war since childhood, trained in combat since they could walk. Their armor cost more than a peasant village earned in a lifetime. For 500 years, heavy cavalry charges had decided European battles. Infantry existed to be trampled. Archers were annoyances, support troops at best. Real men, noble men, fought with swords and lances on horseback. This was the natural order of things, ordained by God and proven on 1,000 battlefields. Edward III knew he was in desperate straits, outnumbered 3-1, exhausted from weeks of raiding, low on supplies, with the French army between him and safety. Any conventional battle would be a slaughter. The English would be destroyed. But Edward had something the French didn't respect: 5,000 Welsh and English longbowmen. These archers were mostly peasants, commoners, and even criminals, the dregs of society in noble eyes. But they had been practicing with their bows since childhood because English law literally required it. Every Sunday after church, English males had to practice archery by royal decree. It was illegal to play other sports if you could be practicing with a bow instead. Football, dice games, even certain festivals were banned to ensure men spent their time shooting. The result was a generation of men who could use the longbow with terrifying effectiveness. The longbow itself was deceptively simple: a 6-foot piece of yew wood, usually cut from trees that grew with one side in shade and one in sun, creating wood with different densities perfect for creating spring and power. Nothing fancy, no complex mechanisms like a crossbow. Just bent wood and string. But in trained hands, it was devastating. These archers could accurately shoot 12 arrows per minute into a target at 250 yards. That's an arrow every 5 seconds, accurately at the distance of 2.5 football fields. The draw weight was immense, 150 to 180 pounds. To put that in perspective, most modern compound hunting bows have a draw weight of 50 to 70 pounds. The English longbow required 3 times that force to draw fully. Archaeologists can actually identify medieval longbowmen by their skeletons. Years of training from childhood deformed their bodies. Their left arms were inches longer than their right from holding that massive draw weight. Their spines twisted. Their shoulder blades thickened. The longbow literally reshaped human bones. This wasn't a weapon you could pick up and use. It took a lifetime to master. But that lifetime of training was about to pay off in the most spectacular fashion. Edward positioned his army on a slope near Crecy, forcing the French to attack uphill, always an advantage. He arranged his men in 3 divisions with the archers forming a V-shape between them, creating overlapping fields of fire. Any enemy advancing toward the English center would be shot at from 2 angles simultaneously. Then Edward did something that shocked both armies. He ordered his knights to dismount and fight on foot. English nobles, men who had trained their entire lives for the thunder of the mounted charge, were told to stand in the mud like common infantry. It was unprecedented. It was an insult to centuries of tradition. Knights fought on horseback. That's what made them knights. To dismount was to fight like a peasant. But Edward forced the issue, understanding something the French didn't. The age of the mounted knight was ending, and survival mattered more than tradition. The English spent the night preparing the battlefield with methodical care. They dug ditches and concealed holes in front of their position to break up cavalry charges. They drove sharpened stakes into the ground at angles designed to impale charging horses. They turned the terrain into a carefully designed killing field. Archers prepared their yew bows, rubbing beeswax into the strings to keep them waterproof. They stuck spare arrows in the ground in front of their positions for quick access during battle. Chronicles say Edward even distributed meat and ale so his men could sleep with full stomachs. Meanwhile, on the French side, chaos reigned. Nobles rode past each other in gleaming armor, banners snapping in the wind. Dukes and counts squabbled openly about who would have the honor of leading the charge, who would capture Edward alive for ransom, who would achieve the greatest glory. Some bragged they would bring the English king back in chains before nightfall. Philip VI's attempts to impose order were drowned out by the clamor of trumpets, war drums, and aristocratic boasting. The French army looked less like a disciplined military force and more like a tournament that had gotten out of control. Philip VI's army arrived at Crecy around 4 p.m. on August 26, exhausted from a long march. The smart move, the obvious move, would have been to rest and attack fresh the next morning. Philip actually ordered exactly that: a halt, make camp, attack tomorrow. But French nobility didn't do patient. They didn't do tactical waiting. They saw the English on that hill, outnumbered, tired, far from home, and they smelled glory. Every noble wanted to be the one who killed or captured Edward III. The honor, the ransom, the songs that would be sung about them for generations, it was too tempting. Behind Philip, counts and dukes surged forward, shouting that the day was wasting and glory was slipping away. The king's command dissolved. The French army was no longer an army. It was a mob of impatient aristocrats who refused to let discipline stand in the way of vanity. Then, around late afternoon, dark clouds gathered. A sudden rainstorm soaked the field, turning it to mud. The French knights laughed, confident their plate armor would protect them from a little rain. But the storm meant something very different for the missile troops on both sides. The English longbowmen calmly unstrung their bows and tucked the strings under their helmets and inside their clothes, keeping them dry. It was a practiced motion drilled into them through years of training. The Genoese crossbowmen fighting for the French had no such precaution. Their bowstrings were attached to their weapons. When wet hemp strings stretched and sagged, the crossbows became nearly useless, their range drastically reduced. A tiny detail, a few minutes of foresight, was about to decide the fate of thousands. The first French assault began with about 5,000 Genoese crossbowmen, the finest mercenary missile troops money could buy. These were professionals, experienced soldiers who had fought across Europe. But there was a problem. Their pavises, large wooden shields they normally hid behind while reloading, were still with the baggage train miles behind. They would have to advance without cover. And their bowstrings were wet from the rain, reducing their effective range. The Genoese advanced, getting into what they thought was range, about 150 yards, and fired a volley. Most of their bolts fell short or lacked penetrating power. Then the English responded. 5,000 longbows released simultaneously. Witnesses described the sound as like thunder rolling across the valley. The sky literally darkened with arrows. Each English archer was putting out 12 arrows per minute. That's 60,000 arrows per minute falling on the Genoese position. 1,000 arrows every single second. The Genoese had no shields, no cover, and their crossbows took 30 seconds to reload versus 5 seconds for a longbow. They were being deleted from existence. Men fell by the hundreds, pierced by multiple arrows, unable to advance or effectively return fire. They broke and ran, streaming back toward the French lines in panic. And here's where it gets absolutely insane. The Count d'Alençon, seeing the Genoese retreating, didn't see fellow soldiers in distress. He saw cowards blocking his path to glory. He shouted words that became infamous. "Kill me this rabble that blocks our way." The French knights charged into their own mercenaries. They trampled them with their war horses. They cut them down with swords. They literally murdered hundreds of their own hired troops for the crime of not dying fast enough. The Genoese were caught between English arrows from ahead and French swords from behind. Those who survived fled the field entirely, cursing their French employers and swearing never to serve them again. This wasn't just a military blunder. It was a window into the aristocratic mindset. These common mercenaries were less than nothing compared to noble honor and glory. Now came the main French assault. 12,000 mounted knights in waves, charging uphill through mud, over the bodies of dead Genoese, straight into the teeth of the English arrow storm. This is where we need to understand what a longbow arrow actually did to armor and horses. At long range, arrows might not penetrate good plate armor directly. But they didn't need to. Horses, even when armored, had vulnerable spots: eyes, mouths, legs, exposed bellies. A 1,500-pound warhorse hit by multiple arrows doesn't charge in a straight line. It screams, rears, stumbles, and falls, creating a massive obstacle. Knights behind crashed into fallen horses and riders. The charge lost momentum immediately, becoming a tangled mess of thrashing animals and cursing men. At closer range, under 100 yards, longbow arrows with bodkin points, narrow, armor-piercing tips, could punch through mail and even plate armor at weak points. They went through visors into faces, through joints into armpits, through mail gaps into thighs and necks. But even non-penetrating hits were devastating. The impact of an arrow hitting plate armor was like being struck with a hammer. Multiple hits rattled knights inside their armor like dice in a cup, causing concussions and internal injuries even without penetration. The French came in waves, each one climbing over the dead of the previous charge. The battlefield became a nightmare landscape of corpses. Horses and men piled so thick that later charges literally had to climb over bodies to advance. The English archers, with their prepositioned arrows stuck in the ground for quick access, maintained continuous fire. Contemporary accounts describe the arrow storm as so thick that charging knights couldn't see through it. The sky went dark with shafts. But it wasn't just arrows killing the French. The battlefield Edward had prepared now revealed its deadly purpose. Horses hit the hidden ditches and shattered their legs. Knights crashed into sharpened stakes concealed in the grass. The mud from the rain turned the slope into a slippery hell where dismounted knights in 60 pounds of armor could barely move. They became stationary targets, and English archers rarely missed stationary targets. Amid this carnage, one of the most legendary moments in medieval history unfolded: the death of King John of Bohemia. John had been blind for about a decade, suffering from an eye disease that had stolen his sight. But when he heard that a great battle was being fought, he insisted on joining. When reports reached him that the battle was going badly, that the French were being slaughtered, he allegedly said, "The King of Bohemia does not flee from a battle." He ordered his knights to tie their horses' reins to his so they could guide him into combat. This 50-year-old blind king wanted to strike at least one blow with his sword before dying. He would not retreat. He would not watch from safety. He would charge. And charge he did, led by his loyal knights, straight into the English lines, swinging his sword at sounds and shadows, at the clash of steel and the screams of dying men. He and all the knights attached to him were killed almost immediately, cut down by arrows and English men-at-arms. When they found his body after the battle, King John was still tied to his dead companions, his sightless eyes open, his sword in his hand. He had achieved his wish, he had struck the enemy before dying. Edward III's son, the Black Prince, was so moved by this display of suicidal courage that he took John's personal emblem, 3 ostrich feathers with the motto Ich diene, I serve, which remains the symbol of the Prince of Wales to this day. The blind king's death represented something profound, the last pure expression of chivalric honor, choosing certain death over retreat, wanting glory even in blindness. His death symbolized the end of an era when honor mattered more than survival. As the sun moved toward the horizon, the French charged again. And again. And again. 16 times. 16 separate waves of French nobility threw themselves at the English position. Each charge was less organized than the last. French nobles were literally fighting each other to get to the front, to have their chance at glory, only to die in the mud like all the others. Philip VI himself charged with one of the final waves. His horse was killed under him. An arrow went through his jaw. His personal guard had to physically drag the wounded king from the field as he tried to return to the fight. The sacred oriflamme, the battle banner of France that supposedly guaranteed victory when unfurled, was abandoned in the mud, trampled by French and English alike. The English, for their part, couldn't believe they were winning. They stayed in defensive position all night, killing any wounded French who moved. They'd run out of arrows multiple times during the battle and had resorted to a grim solution. They ran forward into the killing field, pulled arrows out of dead and dying French knights and fired them back. The French were being killed with recycled arrows, their own suffering literally returned to them. English peasant archers were using knives, hammers, and sharpened stakes to finish off dismounted French knights who couldn't rise from the mud in their heavy armor. Common-born men were beating French nobles to death with sticks and farm tools. The entire social order of medieval Europe was being challenged in the most brutal way possible. When dawn came on August 27th, the scale of the slaughter became horrifyingly clear. The cream of French nobility lay dead in the mud. The Count of Flanders, the Count of Blois, the Duke of Lorraine, the Count of Auxerre, the Count of Sancerre, the list went on and on. 11 princes. 80 banners, meaning 80 lords significant enough to carry their own heraldic banner into battle. Around 1,500 nobles total. Thousands of lesser knights. Nearly all the Genoese who hadn't fled after being attacked by their own employers. The English losses? Approximately 40 dead, including only 2 knights. Read that again. 1 English knight died for every 750 French nobles killed. The disparity was so extreme that contemporary chroniclers didn't believe their own records. Some claimed divine intervention. God himself must have fought for the English. The idea that English peasants with bows could simply be better at war than French knights was literally unthinkable. But there was no divine intervention. Just preparation, discipline, technology, and tactics defeating courage and tradition. The aftermath was grotesque in ways beyond the mere body count. So many nobles died that there weren't enough people of appropriate rank to bury them properly. You couldn't have a peasant bury a duke. It was socially unthinkable. But there were too many dead nobles and too few living ones. Bodies lay rotting for days. Crows, ravens, and wolves feasted on princely flesh. The scavenger birds became so gorged that locals reported they could barely fly, hopping from corpse to corpse, too bloated to take wing. Local peasants looted the noble corpses, finding enough wealth in jewelry, weapons, and armor to transform their lives. The armor that couldn't save its wearers was stripped, melted down, and sold. For years afterward, farmers plowing the fields would turn up noble bones and pieces of rusted armor, grim reminders of the day European nobility died in the mud. France went into shock. The loss of so many nobles in a single afternoon created a massive power vacuum. Entire regions lost their lords. Administrative systems collapsed. Legal disputes froze because the judges were dead. Trade agreements dissolved because the nobles who made them were corpses. But the deeper wound was psychological. For 500 years, being a knight meant being militarily superior. Your noble blood, blessed by God himself, made you better at war than commoners. This was the foundation of the entire feudal system. Nobles ruled because they fought, and they fought better than anyone. Crecy proved that a Welsh peasant with a stick could kill a French duke just as dead as another knight could. Military superiority didn't come from blood or divine favor. It came from technology, training, and tactics. If noble blood didn't make you superior in combat, what justified the entire social order? The question hung in the air across Europe, whispered in taverns and shouted in fields. The nobles had no good answer. Today, a small monument marks the field at Crecy. Tour buses rarely stop. Most people have never heard of the battle. But on August 26, 1346, on that muddy slope in northern France, the medieval world fundamentally changed. 500 years of military tradition, the entire concept of warrior nobility, the romance of knightly combat, all of it died in a single afternoon, killed by commoners with bent sticks and string. The English didn't just win a battle at Crecy. They proved that courage couldn't beat mathematics, that nobility couldn't stop arrows, that the age of the mounted knight was ending whether aristocrats accepted it or not. The French lost more than men that day. They lost their entire understanding of how war worked, how society worked, how the world worked. And what did it take to destroy 500 years of tradition? 5,000 peasants who practiced archery every Sunday after church, led by a king practical enough to dismount his own knights, facing an enemy too proud to wait for morning. The blind king of Bohemia got his glorious death, charging into battle despite his disability. But his courage, however admirable, was also the perfect symbol of medieval nobility's fatal flaw, choosing glory over victory, honor over survival, tradition over adaptation. The French would repeat the same mistake 10 years later at Poitiers, charging English archers with the same results. It would take them nearly a century to fully adapt to the reality that common archers were more valuable than noble knights. But on that August day in 1346, as crows too fat to fly hopped between noble corpses, as English peasants looted French princes, as the oriflamme of France lay trampled in the mud, medieval warfare died. And nothing would ever be the same.